let's look at a mighty fortress. Now, unfortunately, as you can see, I have the Excalibur Decision Games reprint. I would have preferred getting the old SPI version, but at the time I bought this, it was very, very hard to find a cheap copy of the old thing. Even in flat pack, in box, it's still ridiculous. It's been pointed out to me now that, yeah, you can get a good flat pack for 50. Noble Knight has a player's copy for 25. Overall, Excalibur really tried to not tinker with this. They didn't change the rules much. Even to the extent that the old errata still has to be inserted. What they did was they added some graphics. They changed the map graphics, they changed the counter, with colors and stuff. In changing the map graphics, of course, anything they touch they have to make an error on, so they left the name of Hess off the map. There may be some other little mistakes. In changing and adding graphics and putting it on shiny paper, well, they made it a little less usable. It's harder to incorporate the errata into the rules now. I gotta use like a permanent marker, which I don't have, which is a real problem right now, because they did one thing. They managed to introduce an error no matter what. And maybe there are more in the victory conditions. On the Habsburg player card, they completely fucked the initial deployment of forces. You can see, they've got all the forces correct, actually, but they've got all the hex locations wrong. They took the Lutheran hex locations and fitted them to all the Habsburg positions. I actually have to go back and fix that. But, so this setup is actually wrong for the Habsburgs. For everyone else, it's right. I did a best guess on it and came kind of close, because you can kind of guess where things are going to be. They're going to be in the major cities, but yeah, there's different forces in Franche-Comté than I thought. Different forces up in the Netherlands than I thought. I thought there were some navies up there at the beginning. This is a game I really, really wanted. When I first saw it, it was probably in the mid-'80s. Well, it was definitely in the mid-'80s. And I was like, oh, God, the Reformation itself, the political actions going on at the time, there was nothing out there at that point of this nature. And then, of course, Here I Stand came along some time ago, and I managed to catch that, and I'm like, wow, this is better than that looks. However, I still had the craving for this. It was a much lighter game than Here I Stand, which is kind of consistent with the era it came from. It's not that ancient a game, but there was a tendency of the companies to put out the big strategic games that weren't, World War II especially, but you could go back as far as Napoleonic and whatever and get some level of detail in the games. You start going back to the Reformation and they're like, well, we don't know much about the military situation, and they didn't really have the interest in applying really exciting new systems to the political and other aspects to the game. So it's got a very simple diplomatic design to the game, which is you can make agreements, But there's not, and then it's got an economic component as well. But it's, again, a very simple one. You collect some money and you pay it out. Certainly Here I Stand has a lot more flavor, a lot more special events in it. I don't think there's any kind of events in this. All right, so let's start taking a look at what we got. First of all, the military counters are quite simple. And I believe that's the movement point allowance that's on them. Yep. And then the naval counters are kind of like the army counters, just a number on them. Nothing fancy going on here at all. You've got a segmentation of the board into different regions. So, and you've got some kind of, they didn't do a very good job. By making the map full color, they make it jump out who owns what more. Orange is kind of neutral. But they also, of course, not having any design competence over at Excalibur made it kind of hard to read as well. The original in its brown tones I find so much more attractive, but whatever. All right, so yeah, you have individual areas which are groups of hexes in general. Now some of the cities are their own little area. So like Augsburg is its own area. It's harder to tell in the neutral territories if there are any such. I don't see any, but whatever. And you'll have some specific kind of weirdnesses going on. So for example, France is a major country that comprises of two areas, France and Scotland. Because during this period, while Scotland wasn't completely subordinated to France, their anti-English stance made them a common ally, and instead of making them, their own power. Now, it's a little weird to have France just be one huge monolithic area, but that actually makes France easier to defend. This is post, 100 Years' War era. It was going to be hard to divide France up, I guess, is the idea. Same thing with Spain. It's one monolithic area. The Ottoman Empire, it's really one monolithic area. Austria, though, is the Habsburg territories are more of a ramshackle empire than anything else. And each of these territories is sort of an individual inheritance. So it kind of makes sense to split them up. This isn't really, Germany as a whole is kind of a weird situation, and the Lutheran player is a special case. And then the Papal States have their own little existence here as a separate player, and then they have the three archbishop electors in Germany. All right, so the basic of play is you're going to be playing an I go, you go type of thing, but with 6 players or whatever. And the first thing that happens is everybody's allowed to move their units and conduct combat in player order. Then you're going to collect taxes, and some of this is advanced game. I'm going to just lump that in. And you get your income based on, I think, just the cities you have. I don't think territories count. You're not producing enough income to count. Diplomacy phase, you're basically able to cut deals. This is one of those, SPI had this weird idea about diplomacy, which was that it doesn't count unless you write it down. This applies to a number of games, Empires and Arms, a few others, where they had this really specific, you have to write it down, but it's not binding for the most part. In Empires and Arms, there's a strict penalty for writing a negotiation piece down and it not being fulfilled. There isn't in this, as far as I can tell, but you still have to write them all down, which feels a little funky, but some of it, basically anything that affects gameplay, like if you're allowing someone through your territory or something, you do have to write it down. But you don't have to comply with it, which I think is goofy. All right, then back to an advanced game rule, you have to spend money in order to maintain your units, in order to move, fight, and in order to build new units. This is kept track of and then paid at this point. How you do that? Well, yeah, good question. We'll probably use poker chips and push things aside or whatever. And then you get any reinforcements. Some reinforcements will be set up by the game. So for example, the Lutherans have a set of reinforcements coming in, which I question because it opens up with one Jesuit in Rome. Is that intentional? Is that another transcription error? The rest of them appear to be Lutheran reinforcements. Well, if we look at the papacy, they get Jesuits coming in at various times. I'm wondering if that's meant to be a pro-Lutheran in Rome, if it's just an error, or if it should be located somewhere else. Luckily for me, the Habsburg card was available on BGG. The front of all the cards is available. The backs are not. So I don't know what the answer is to that. It's probably an Excalibur Decision Games fuck up because they're so good at it. And basically what happened was their incredible addition of little black and white photos and printing on gloss paper and maybe a little bit of reformatting to how things went, because the original cards were smaller than these. They didn't have pictures on them. They were fairly easy to use. These guys are bigger and not as effective as far as I'm concerned. But in terms of, hey, we touched it, well, they broke it. No matter what happens, if anything Doc's involved in seems to be a terrible thing. And I don't think he particularly did it, but it's just like he buys rights or somehow gets around to publishing. And this is what he basically did. He hunted down the titles that went for a lot of money, and this was one of them. And then that was just basically the decision of whether to reprint it. Now, whether or not it's a good game, and I don't know how he managed to get rights to them. Sometimes that's hard to track down. Maybe he plays a little fast and loose with it. But whatever happens, the reprint ends up never being as good as the original, which is kind of a sad thing. One possible exception to that is that I can think of is War in the Pacific. Now, I'm pretty sure the reprint's not as good as the original in a lot of ways, but it's bigger. They turned it into a monstrosity. I mean, you're already talking about a monster game that basically almost nobody manages to play, and they basically increased this number of counters by a factor of 10. And you just sit there stunned at how they could take a monster and make it more monstrous. A monster that most people who have tried it have never completed. There's a group that plays it at Consim Expo. Every year they come by and they set it up and play it for the week, and then put it away and start back from wherever they ended up. Interesting thing. Anyway, where are we? So some of the units come on as reinforcements. Otherwise, you get replacements. Now, in the basic game, replacements just sort of automatically accrue. In the advanced game, you have to pay to get them on the board. And then the game turn indication moves forward, and you start back over campaigning. So the campaign game is obviously sort of the meat of the game, and there's not much here. There really isn't. Sequence of play is fixed. Ottoman Papacy, Habsburg, France, England, Lutherans. You can move as many units as you like. You can attack if you're adjacent. No, you must attack if you're adjacent. And then if you're in the same space as a theologian if you have a theologian in the same space as a theologian of the opposite alignment, Lutherans and Catholics are the only ones who do this, you can debate them and try to remove them from the board is basically what you're trying to do. There's different degrees, remove them from the space. There's different degrees to which that can be successful. You could get them burned at the stake. Movement's pretty simple. Everything's one movement point. There's some special rules for sea transport, but that's about it. Armies can't enter into the hex of another army. Navies can't enter into the hex of another navy. Everything's pretty reasonable there. Extended naval movement. So in the basic game, extended naval movement is you announce how far you're going to move, and you roll a die. And you announce how many additional hexes you want to move. What is it, up to 2 or something? No, up to twice or 3 times the distance. So normally they have 6, they can go up to 12 or 18. You roll a die, and either a 1 through 4 for the 12 or a 1 or a 2 for the 18 allows you to make that full move. Otherwise, you make no move. Great. In the advanced game, you'll pay money. Well, you could do it this way, or you could pay money to determine how far you get to move. Anyway, there's no real cost to failure to move. You don't like sink or anything. It's just you either, and in a lot of cases, you either want to move very far or you don't want to move at all. So this random thing is not really a big deal. Okay, transportation. Armies, I believe, can carry, fleets can carry, I believe, 1 army each. Gotta look. Okay, if you want to load onto a ship after if you want to move to a ship and get on it, the extra movement points get charged to the ship. And likewise, if you want to get off the ship, whatever movement points the ship's already expended are charged to your unit if it wants to keep moving afterwards, which is kind of a neat thing. It probably only works because everything's got the same movement allowance. You can carry 2 armies and 2 missionaries per naval unit. And that, leaving one off doesn't help you. Like, if you leave an army off, you can't carry extra missionaries. I guess the idea is 2 missionaries can, get along on a ship. If a third one came on board, they'd, set it on fire or something. Missionaries move a little faster. They can move 8 hexes instead of, and they have a hidden strength. You see a question mark. You flip them over. This is kind of like Conquistador, where their actual capability to debate is affected by that. If a combat unit moves into a non-city space with a missionary of another player, they have the option to eliminate the missionary, and it goes back in the cup. Now, I only have 1 cup here. I have another one I'm using for clipping counters. I'll try to figure out what to do about that. My situation is not as rich as it was in Phoenix in terms of strange containers and things. Stacking. 2 armies and 2 navies in any non-city hex. Anything else would exceed that. However, armies on board ships don't count against stacking. Now, in cities and ports, there are numbers. So this can hold 3 armies and 6 navies instead of the other dot. We'll see how that affects things. Units have zones of control. The armies and navies. They generally exert it at all times, but they don't cross neutral border. Well, they don't cross borders with countries you're not at war with. They don't cross the wrong type of terrain, so there's not a zone from here to here, you know, from a land unit. Crap like that. Stuff you'd expect. Zones of control can be negated under certain circumstances. During combat, one of your units in a hex negates the zones of control in that hex for your units. This means you can retreat through a zone of control, but you're affected by stacking. Now, the way they say that, I assume you're constantly affected by stacking. So if there's 2 units in a hex, you can't retreat through that hex. 2 armies can't, or another army can't retreat. Or navies versus another navy. During movement, zones of control are never negated. Unfortunately, one of the things that they changed was instead of the nice columns that an SPI game would have in the era, they went to this broad format. I can't read this format. You know, I have real difficulty reading across little paragraphs across a big page. That's always been difficult for me. Just why I type the way I do. But anyway, it's one of their bonuses to their reformatting. They didn't really make the type any bigger either, which would have helped for this aging set of eyes. So what does the zone of control do? You need permission from a person with whom you're allied in order to move through a zone of control. And that you have to have written permission beforehand, and then they have to assent to that particular movement as well. You can also move into a zone of control of a unit you're at war. But remember, zones of control don't cross a border that's not at war. So like France and Spain, if they're not at war, you can move up to the edge of the Spanish border without being interfered with by, say, a French unit whose zone of control you're entering. If you're in a combat phase in a zone of control of a hostile unit, it's going to have to be attacked. And this is kind of the standard sort of, the operational games all have this kind of thing from SPI in this era. Okay. Let's see. You can successfully move out of a zone of control as long as you don't go from zone of control to zone of control, and then you can continue to move normally. That's if you begin your turn that way. Doesn't cost any extra movement. You can't retreat into a zone of control of a hostile unit except if it's screened by apparently one and only one of your units. Combat's mandatory. All units have to attack. All units that exert a zone on them. No. All units that exert a zone on your units must be attacked. Now, there's soak-offs in this, but I think they have to go down to the... I'm trying to find... It's really hard for me to discern stuff when it's big format, and it doesn't help that it's fucking glossy. Yeah. It's like everything in this game is worse than the original. I don't know. I mean, why the hell do I read this? I'm trying to explain something and I don't even know what I'm trying to explain anymore. All the units that have you in their zone of control must be attacked. I'm looking up what the fucking soak-off is. I can't find it because it's just all these little things that used to be tiny little things that you could easily absorb because they take up a third of a page in width. Now I have to spend the whole, to read what's one sentence, I have to go all the way across. Horrible. I can't absorb the rules the way that I could with the SPI rules. Same words, same case numbers, formatting error, And it is an error from my point of view. I cannot absorb a long line like that in the same way that I can absorb all these little case and paragraphs and read them all. I have to scan the whole page back and forth, and it's horrible. So I'm just going to skip through and not give you much. Look, oh, here it is, diversionary attacks. Okay, now that would all be on the same page in the SPI, so I would see that, not have to flip through pages. They bloat the number of pages used because, yeah, the original was probably a 10-page, 12-page game. It's 30 pages now, which makes sense. 3 columns versus, the print, though, doesn't look that much bigger, but they put a lot of spacing in that wasn't in there before, probably. I like spacing, but I don't know. Not like this. So anyway, for a diversionary attack, you have to make at least the 1-to-5 ratio. Let's look at the combat results table, I guess. You can only attack somebody if you're at war with them. That's part of the diplomacy. We look over here, and I've never looked at this. But it's going to give you who gets hit, what they take. The number is how far you have to retreat, exchange, the defender. Okay. The defender is entirely eliminated. Now, I think this was in the original. Let's change that. The smaller force is entirely eliminated. Are there cases where that's, yeah. So like if you're attacking at 1-to-2, the defender is entirely eliminated and the attacker will lose. Maybe it's fair, but I don't like it. And I don't know what I'm even babbling about anymore. Whatever. Right? We hate going through rules when they're broad page. So yeah, we missed, we have eliminateds as well. So retreats, exchanges, and eliminateds. And we're changing the exchange to be the way that we want it to be. So sue me, Some people complain I changed the rules to games. I don't know. Maybe it's in the errata. I don't really feel like flipping through all this. Yeah, this is interesting. The old SPI errata still works. Of course, you can't write it into the book because it's glossy. So you're fucked. But yeah, I don't see anything on the chart, but then again, we don't know because they screwed with the map. Maybe they reworded it to try to make it clearer. And instead of smaller force, changed it to defender and just broke the combat chart. I do remember there being some problems with the original game that I felt had to be fixed. I've never played it, but I did look it over. Actually, I may have fiddled around with it enough to count as a play for me. I don't know. I've got it marked as a play, but I think I'm lying. So when the enemy clears a space, when you defeat the enemy and knock them out of a space, then you're allowed to advance. And just into that space. After advancing, you can't involve yourself in another combat. Retreat has to be back towards your home country. But if it can't, you can go someplace you're allowed to move. Sorry, I don't know how loud that water is. So I have to kind of shout. Okay, sieges work kind of like normal combat, except you use a different combat results table. It has to be at least 1-to-1. And remember, sieges, your enemy might be in a bigger hex that can hold more people. So like Bray holds like 6 armies, I guess. Paris, of course, only holds 2, not being a particularly safe place to be. So let's take a look at the siege table, and what do we get? So we get retreats with honors of war. We'll have to look that up, but otherwise the results: attacker half eliminated. Well, that kind of makes sense. Exchanges, are they written better here? Exchange, all defending units are eliminated. Well, it's at least 1-to-1 on the siege table, so that's not a big deal. And that's about it. I don't see any half exchanges or anything weird like that. So honors of war, you're allowed to retreat through enemies who attacked you's zone of control, but not through other zones of control, because those enemies are the ones paroling you. Why you're not paroled completely, I'm not sure, but whatever. I don't know enough about instances of honors of war in this era to be able to say, well, that seems a little strange. I can say it's different from most games. Most games allow you to jump to the nearest space, but I don't know which I'd trust more. Missionaries and conversion. Okay. The Lutheran and Papal players have their missionaries, and they'll be getting victory points for converting things. Like I said, they're hidden on the other side. We can take a quick look at one of the backs of a Catholic. Now, I find the Catholic symbol a little odd, but okay. So this is a 1-pointer. There's a 2-pointer. I think they run from 1 to 3, but I'm not sure. They don't engage in standard combat. They have no zone of control. They can ignore zones of control of combat units. They're eliminated if they're alone in a non-city hex and a combat unit enters that hex, or if they're stacked with friendly combat units and all those combat units are eliminated or forced to retreat. If the enemy advances into that hex, the missionaries are left behind. They don't retreat with the army. Missionaries can't be killed while they're in cities, though, unless another missionary burns them at the stake. You can move into a city that another player owns if it's unoccupied, if it's only occupied by missionaries, or if it's occupied by both missionaries and combat units. So as long as there's missionaries in the enemy city, even if there's combat units, you can go in there and contest those missionaries. And that's important because those missionaries might be able to convert the city out of your hands. So you're able to defend the city in that way. That's the main reason why you'd want to do that. At the start of the game, all areas are Catholic, except for the Ottoman Empire and those areas in Germany with Lutheran missionaries. Very interesting. We don't have a way to track which areas are Lutheran, and we're going to have to keep track of that on paper or something. It might make sense to put little tiddlywinks or something on the board to indicate which areas have become Lutheran. Only missionary units can convert an area. In order to convert an area, the missionary has to be present in an area and no missionary of the prevailing religion is in the area. Okay. This has changed mightily. This is the real errata here, and the rule book should just be ignored. Okay. So you can convert an area if you're in a city and no missionary of the prevailing religion is in the area at all. So if you make it into a city and you get rid of all their missionaries, which is hard to do because they could just have them anywhere in the area. Alternatively, if your missionary is in an area that's not in a city and no missionary of the prevailing religion is in the area, you can try to convert, you roll, and if the total is higher than the number of army units belonging to the player who controls that area, then the area is converted. That's weird, because if you control the area, even though you've got missionaries there, you may be preventing it from converting as easily if you have a lot of armies there. However, I'm willing to accept that role simply because the armies are enforcing order, and order is the opposite of what conversion sort of is. Conversion is a disorderly process. It's disrupting what's there, and the armies are going to prevent that, even if they're theoretically in favor of it. So you've got to kind of do it in your backline areas or whatever. Ottomans can't be converted. Poland can't be converted. The initial Lutheran areas can be reconverted to Catholicism once you eliminate all Lutheran combat units in that area or city. And those units may not enter the game as replacements until it becomes Lutheran again. Oh, we're going to keep track of that little rule. I don't know. They can't convert the papacy, which the Italian papal states, which is specified in the errata. There may be more kicking around here in the errata. This is one of the, this is the rule that's kind of weird in the game, so. Did they get the rule number right? They may have changed. Yeah, okay. All right. So, if you have theologians, missionaries of opposing sides in the same space, the player whose turn it is can or must. Looks like it just happens. Challenges. They flip their missionaries over and reveal their debate capabilities if they're not revealed. They stay flipped over otherwise. They stay face down, showing the number otherwise. You add up all those values and you come up with a ratio, and then you go to the theological debate table. And I don't know what it says. Yeah, you get your ratio, you roll, and we have exchange. No, that's not on here. So it looks like they fucked up this too. Yeah, so I'm guessing they may have been the ones to introduce the problem in the combat results table. Yeah, it looks like they didn't give any of the values necessary for that. Boy, they screwed this game up. I thought they didn't do much to it, but man, never buy anything from Excalibur or Decision. Wings wasn't that bad, I think. I don't remember. I remember it's probably worse than the Quinto one, but that's hard to do. Let's see if we have results here. Crap. Okay, they didn't bother to give us the results. So we're going to have to kind of make these up, right? Or I can look and try to see if I can find what the actual ones are. Wow. This is what I get for not looking at charts. Well, it looks like they printed an unplayable game out of the box. Wrong setup for the Habsburgs. Combat charts fucked up. Excellent. Thanks, Excalibur. Remember, Excalibur is a division of Decision Games. And this is fucking modern. This is not some, 1990s era screw-up like the one we just saw. Fucking awesome. I don't know if there was a copy of the original map shown there, but what there is they put a player in. I mean, seriously, because I don't know if I could have found this. I would have had to ask people, because it doesn't exist in any of the online resources that I've seen already. I would have had to ask somebody to give me the explanation of what the fucking things mean. It's just ridiculous. And they don't publish any errata They did not publish any standalone errata for this, explaining the errors that they introduced, in addition to the ones that they just decided not to even bother fixing. Okay, so challenger, defender, B is burned at the stake. X is exiled to home country. He has to go back to a city in his home country. He might end up imprisoned for 2 years. Here he can be imprisoned for a couple of years. Stalemate, well, the defender has to either leave or stick around. Not too bad. It's just completely, undecipherable. These charts, yeah, I could figure out what these mean, although D1, D2 I would have taken as casualties because there's no R there. Like I'm used to DR1, DR2, and I bet you... Did they change these? No. I would not be surprised if the original had the DR there and they removed that, just to make it a little less, clear in case they cock something else up. All right, fantastic. So, well, it was a simple game. And easy to learn the rules and everything. I mean, yeah, I read through these rules, but when actually playing, the wide format is horrible for me. Occupation, political control. So how do you control an area? Control changes. Let's look, big, wide, glossy page. Excellent. It's occupied if during diplomacy you have one of your combat units in the area and there are no other country's combat units in the area. The exception has to do with cession of territory. Missionaries don't count. So, for example, for the Habsburgs to control France, they have to have a combat unit somewhere in France and have driven all enemy units out of there, all other units out of there, even allied units. Once it's been determined that occupation and control, and maybe that's changed, we'll look at the old SPI errata, because that does seem a little odd, but I don't see anything there. In the case of neutral areas, the same rules apply, basically. It's just you march in and there's nothing defending them. A little strange, think Switzerland, Savoy, they're important enough they would defend themselves. Nah. Players may find it handy to keep track of who controls an area, not to mention what its religious alignment is, on a piece of paper. Yeah, thanks. Again, this was like a $50, $60 game. They couldn't put a few informational markers to add to it. The original, hey, it probably sold for $10, It probably sold, of course, that's quite a bit now, but it probably sold for about $10, and they really skimped on the counters. But clearly, there wasn't a lot of effort put into making this thing work, It doesn't look like the equivalent for its time period, which is like, 5-6 years ago, at that price point in terms. But I get kind of spoiled because I think GMT prints things so cheap that they're able to pass that savings on very easily. So they become kind of my, fixed point of, well, that's what things should cost. And then I look at Compass, I look at Decision, I look at the other companies, and I'm like, wow, that's a lot to pay for, that. All right. What about diplomacy? So diplomacy covers a few things. It covers whether or not you're at war with one another, which one person is able to declare war on other people, and then they're both at war. In order to stop being at war, you have a couple of options. You can make a truce or a peace treaty. A peace treaty, and both can include other provisions like cession of territory, exchange of money, whatever, as well as non-enforceable aspects, such as, the Lutherans agreeing not to move missionaries into France for 5 years or whatever, forever. It doesn't really matter. Those kind of provisions can be added to the treaty, but they're non-binding. But anything that happens at the moment, transfer of money, territory, that is all binding in the sense that it's happening simultaneously. Some games don't allow simultaneous transfers. It only makes sense here. Anyway, for a peace treaty, you spell out that the two states are no longer at war, any cessions, any whatever. And for truces, you could do the same thing. The difference is you're not at war for a period of time specified in the truce. If a more lasting peace isn't concluded before the end of the truce, the war automatically resumes, unless, you could extend the truce, I guess. An alliance is an agreement between players, and these have to be written out in full, just like everything else. And it has to be announced, but some terms of an alliance can be kept secret until somebody wants to reveal them or something. And just all kinds of conflicts. But anything secret's not going to matter. Why write it down to remember it? Alliances will have an end date, which must be included. An alliance may allow one country's units to pass through another country's territory, and this could happen without a declaration of war. They can allow entry zones of control. I believe the entering territory can't be revoked. I don't see any indication that it can. A little complicated here. It's in diversionary attacks. They got the wrong rules reference here. And chances are that was in the original SPI, because it really does look like they just lifted the rule book. I don't see anything that applies. All right. Yeah, this is taking a long time for what is really a simple engine, but again, you spread the rules across an entire page, in the long ways, that hurts me. It really fucking hurts me. Because I read this. That's all I read. I see this going down about this block. I do not see over here. It's just like a blind spot. Yeah. Well, I'll kind of fake it. Right? You can make ultimatums. In general, they don't mean much, but they do serve a required purpose for the papacy. The papacy can't excommunicate someone unless they issue an ultimatum. First, you can cede territory. The person who is giving the territory up has the right to leave the area, and you have the right to leave the area after a treaty or whatever as well. Okay. Victory points, we'll go into these a little bit more later, but for now, in the base game, you have a set of victory conditions. This is not a great idea. Well, fine. You have a set of victory conditions of things that you gain or lose points for gaining or losing, for doing throughout the game. Now, some of the players have additional sets of victory, or multiple sets of victory conditions, which you always use the historical in the basic game for whatever reason. But in the advanced game, you randomly determine what your victory conditions are, and nobody knows what they are. You don't get to pick the ones that you like. It's random. So there are certain games, Star Trader in the Ares magazine you can pick your choice of like up to 3 or 4 different, out of 3 or 4 different victory conditions, maybe it's 2 or 3. And quite often there are ones that are like strictly harder. There's just no way that it's going to be easier. And then there are ones that are fairly clear that they're going to be significantly harder to do. And it doesn't really matter whether anybody knows what you have. Quite often the easiest is just money in that. Well, in this, you're stuck with whichever victory condition that you get assigned at the beginning of the game, which is kind of cool. Kind of like when you play, what the hell is it? The Origins of World War II with kind of the random slips for victory conditions. Well, it had better be random slips for victory conditions and points that are connected. If you disconnect those two, you get a really crazy game. All right, I'm going to take a break for a while before I go to the advanced game. This has taken a lot more effort than I thought and has been a lot more painful than I thought. Okay, a little bit quieter now, and let's look at the advanced game rules, which we'll, of course, play with. Finances. So during taxation, you get cash. You start with a certain amount of fixed money, and you get revenue for each of the cities that you either control or occupy. Now, the way this is worded is a little weird. These cities can supply full income only to the original controller. If they're held by any other player, they only provide half the income. Those are the italicized ones on this list. There is one error there that's not from the original game that was not introduced by Excalibur. Now, what does that mean? It's kind of weird because it's control or occupy, which kind of means, if read literally, and this is a problem with these rules, you can't read them literally. And a problem with a lot of rules, to be honest. I'm fine with it, but I like to point these out. If read literally, if I control Austria, but somebody's captured Vienna, I would get full value from Vienna and they would get half. That's not what I think was intended. I think what's intended is whoever occupies the city gets the income unless, whoever controls it gets the income unless it's occupied by an enemy, in which case, or by someone, in which case that person gets the cash. Of course, how that interacts with alliances and stuff, I think you just have to kind of use a little common sense there instead of trying to rigorously interpose the rules there. The controlling player receives income from a city actually occupied no matter what the military situation may be, as long as he has a combat unit. This actually seems to cover it. However, if you control it, it will provide income to the player only if a line of hexes may be traced from the city hex back to any hex in the player's country. So yeah, I mean, even control, if you were the last person there. And the reason for that is you have to pay maintenance for your units. So as long as the units are there, they're going to be able to use the money. You might get more than the maintenance, but all right. So you have to pay for things in this game. Actually, maybe I'm wrong about maintenance. I think I'm wrong. When you buy when you get one replacement units, you have to pay 2 guilders, $2, to get the replacement, and it'll come in the turn after you expend the payment for them. There are mercenaries in the game, and generally Swiss mercenaries, but the Ottomans have janissaries. These units don't start on the board. They cost 5 guilders to raise and 5 guilders to come back if eliminated. But otherwise they're treated as replacements. Whenever you move your units, the number of hexes, any number of hexes, you must spend a third of your income for the game turn. However, if you engage in an active belligerent activity, and there'll be a list, you spend your full income for the game turn. Which is why you might want truces. You don't pay the additional third. So these things count as belligerent actions: a declaration of war, movement of combat units into or within any areas not under your control, or an attack on a hostile combat unit, whether in your area or not. For each combat unit you use in attack or defense, you must spend 1 guilder. This means if you're attacked, you'll be forced to spend money. The exception is you can never go below 0 in this way. In such a case, the defending player would defend free of cost for any units that would drop his level below 0. No attacks may be made for which treasury funds are lacking. Now that's interesting. You're required to attack, but if you do not have the cash, you don't have to attack. That leads to some situations that make me think that maybe these rules weren't as carefully written as they thought. In addition, if you make an attack, it costs your entire income for the turn. So if you had no money, you may be in a situation where you have to pay your entire income plus $1 per unit to attack, and you may not have enough to do that. And then do you get it all back because you couldn't afford any of it? Again, some weird situations show up here, and this is all from the original. Declarations of war cannot be ended unilaterally. Both sides have to agree. However, if a country making a declaration of war makes no belligerent acts for 2 full years, by the list up there, the declaration of war lapses and it's no longer in effect. And that's specific to the economic, or to the advanced game, because the economic rules pose I'm not sure why, to tell you the truth. Because you don't have to pay just from being at war. It's only if you actually do things while you're at war that it's a problem. So I'm not entirely sure about that. You can declare war on multiple countries at once. However, you don't get charged additional. So there's an advantage to declaring war on more than one person at once. Kinda, I guess. Okay. Here, friendly combat units in enemy cities do not wholly control the country do not incur full income costs. They're considered garrison units, and as long as they don't attack or move, they won't be considered moving into or within an area not under control. Just that clarification to make things easier. You're allowed to borrow money from other players. However, there are rules against this. A loan has to be in a written statement. It could be part of a treaty or alliance, or it could be separate. Loans can be for any length of time and any terms mutually agreed upon by the players. There are several exceptions. No Catholic country can ever lend to another Catholic country, with the exception of the papacy. A Catholic country is one that is neither Lutheran nor Ottoman. The Pope may never charge interest. We haven't gotten to... Somewhere or another you can declare yourself Lutheran. On any loan to any Catholic country, he may demand other terms. It doesn't say other people can't demand interest from the Pope. Catholic and non-Catholic countries may freely arrange loans among themselves. However, Catholic countries dealing with non-Catholic countries may end up excommunicated. If you fail to repay a loan, nothing happens. Why do we have to write this down again? Augment, well, because money can't be transferred. But you can't give gifts either, which theoretically you should be able to by the church. In the advanced game, there's an option. Instead of using the extended movement where you roll a die, you can buy the movement. Each ship that wishes to move an additional 6 hexes costs an additional guilder. Each ship that wishes to move 12 extra costs 3 additional guilders. Now, they don't make any suggestions as to which one makes more sense, and both kind of make sense. Like, to me, it's you should have to pay more, and maybe it doesn't work, and you wouldn't have to spend them more. However, their indication is you do one or the other. Either you take a chance at making it the long distance, which to me is kind of a failed planning is the real thing, because you stay exactly where you started if you don't make the roll, or you pay the money. And I'm tempted to say you should do both. You should allocate the money, roll the die. If the die succeeds, you pay the money and you make the move. But because that's the only circumstance that actually makes money. It makes sense to me. You do have to pay more to commission your fleet on a larger trip. And there is a chance that your administrative capabilities won't allow you to launch it in time, that the weather, that something else will get in trouble. And the money's not really expended. Some of it may be, but as a whole, the resources that you've put into play are still available largely, unless you're buying consumables and they're rotting. Okay, excommunication. Excommunication, the Pope is able to do this to people who violate certain precepts. The Pope can excommunicate only Catholics. The other 3 countries are Catholic if they haven't turned into Lutherans, which appears to be an advanced game, which is why we haven't seen it. And it's under 18, which seems to indicate everybody can't go Lutheran, unlike in EU. The Pope can communicate only for the following reasons: a belligerent action against a territory controlled by the Pope, any Catholic country making a formal alliance with the Lutherans, any Catholic country lending money to a non-Catholic country, voluntarily allowing Lutheran missionaries to enter and remain within the country's territory, including voluntary conversion by alliance, treaty, or whatever. In such cases, the Pope must initiate the excommunication process immediately. Failure to do so stops him from being able to excommunicate a Catholic. And finally, Henry's divorce. The formal process takes place in the diplomacy phase. First, the reasons must be issued in a papal bull, which is considered an ultimatum. If the player fails to heed the bull, on any succeeding turn following the issuance of the bull, the Pope may excommunicate the player by formal written proclamation, and it states the reason for such. Unless specifically stated in the proclamation, excommunication lasts for the remainder of the game or until the country is reverted to Lutheranism. The papal player should use his power wisely, because he might throw somebody into the enemy's camp. The effects of excommunication take place immediately. For the first 2 years that you're excommunicated, you lose 1 victory point per year. Starting with the 3rd year of excommunication, you stop losing victory points, but you lose half your income for that year. And you'll continue to lose it until the excommunication is withdrawn or you decide that you're Lutheran. The effects of excommunication differ slightly in the case of the divorce question. The Pope can rescind the order of excommunication. He can do it for any reason or agreement. However, if at any time the excommunicated player satisfies the requirements of the ultimatum issued for that excommunication, satisfies the requirements of the ultimatum, the Pope must withdraw it. Countries may be excommunicated more than once during the game, and this gets kind of weird, but an excommunicated country may not be excommunicated again. Why? What does it mean that you're excommunicated again? Does the clock start again? Can I excommunicate you, take 2 victory points away from you, which might be the bigger deal, and then withdraw the excommunication, and then issue another bull because you do something else? will the victory points start hitting you, or will it be the income? I would say you can only lose 2 victory points due to excommunication over the course of the game. Not specified. Might be in the errata. Communication does not stop. It continues for 3 years after the year the country becomes Lutheran. That's interesting. Voluntary conversion of Lutheranism is announcing yourself to be Lutheran. You may still be excommunicated by the Pope. I don't know. You can lend armies to other players. I assume there's no interest involved in that. All kind of weird stuff is considered in the errata. And again, this is kind of loose. The errata seems almost looser at times. Let's swap batteries and get to divorce. Divorce has a lot of specific rules. It's only Henry VIII's divorce because it's such a weird situation where England didn't really want to go Protestant particularly, but Henry needs an heir. The English player has 3 years starting from the beginning of the game to ask for an annulment. If he doesn't do so, he loses 10 victory points. This is a huge loss, so you're going to do it. Scripting, right? Once a dispensation is requested, then we go to other steps. If the Pope denies the request, the English player has to decide to go ahead with the divorce or stop. If the English player does not go through, he still loses that 10 victory points. He can't ask for the divorce and then back down without it being just as bad. Once the English player so he's probably going to do it. Once the English player has requested a dispensation, the Pope has 2 years to either deny or grant it. If the English player formally requests it if the Pope decides to deny the request, he formally announces it to the English player. The English player then insists on going through with the divorce. The papal player can allow the annulment or excommunicate the English player. And this is where the real choice kind of falls in. Denying the request, the English insistence, and the issuance of a papal bull, if you don't issue the bull, it's just as though you allow the annulment to proceed. In the case of a papal bull, the order of excommunication must follow in the very next turn unless the English player decides to back down. If the papal player specifically grants an annulment, he loses 12 victory points. Well, that's not going to happen either. However, England remains Catholic, but can convert to Lutheranism at any time. If the papal player allows the English player to obtain an annulment, he only loses 10 victory points. Again, it's too big an amount, so it's almost guaranteed in here. If the Pope succeeds in blocking the annulment or divorce without excommunicating the English player, he gains 5 victory points. The only other option is excommunication. England will lose 2 victory points for each year he's excommunicated, with up to 4 points lost in 2 years, a little worse than normal. So now we're talking about a 6-point difference instead of a 10-point difference for him. Becomes a little bit more interesting. However, if England is no longer a Catholic country, she is not a Lutheran country either, and she'll lose victory points if she has a Lutheran missionary in her territory at the end of the game. While England may not be Lutheran, the other Catholic countries must treat her as such, and this could cause an excommunication. Once England is excommunicated under this section, the annulment and resultant marriage are considered to have taken place. The Pope cannot rescind the excommunication. Players should also note if England becomes excommunicated or interdicted, the 2 remaining Catholic countries gain extra victory points for taking English objectives. All right, the variable victory conditions. Certain players have several sets of victory conditions. A player's victory objectives should be secret. Their feeling kind of is like my feeling about games, hey, the historical are fine to use the first time because you won't know them. And that really is how I feel, like with a CDG, how I feel that CDGs are really cool because you've got these secret events in there, unless you kind of have to know the events and understand them and manipulate that understanding of what the future is going to hold in order to play the game to create historically accurate results. I don't mind if you know the game too much and can cheat it. I mean, I do, but it's not as big a bother as you have to know the game too much in order to play it correctly, which is my biggest grump against Paths of Glory, to tell you the truth. Okay. And that's about it. Now, they say players should note that variable objectives never apply to points lost, only points gained. Let's take a look at some of those to see what's interesting. So the papacy, yeah, we've got points lost listed here. And like, wow, we really don't want the Habsburgs to lose to the Ottomans. Now, this is a lot because we've got to pay attention to a lot of different things, and it's going to be tough for me to solo this in that case. So here, the loss for failure to control, it's at the end after all the variable sets of things that you'd aim for. And the things that you'd aim for, you know, the historical might create a closer to the realistic, to the historical, not realistic, but to the historical objectives that were pursued. But these others are reasonable ones that are historically feasible, you know. Why Belgrade is 4 here and less here. You know, it's balanced for a certain amount of points. I don't think the historical is terribly historically necessary there. Here, these guys, no options. The French have options, and again, they're all things they're interested in. It's just really a variance by how much they're interested in given things. For example, this one, it looks like, wow, we really want to go to Britain. Now, what's awesome about this is the 4-point British Plymouth is doubled to 8. Of course, there's 6 points of British points here, but that's probably harder to get. So if you actually had a choice, and this one's not anti-English at all, if you actually had a choice of what you wanted to go to, you might negotiate out what your victory points are, but you don't. It has to be random, you know. But it will affect how the play goes, and the Brits also have a set of them. They don't want the Habsburgs to be too powerful in northern Germany. It's interesting. Now, points lost if a Lutheran missionary is in England. They're the only country that has that. And I would guess that that's the case even if they become Lutheran. I'm not sure that makes sense, but why give them an advantage for becoming actually Lutheran, which they can do. All right, let's send this up and a little bit more of a break, probably eat something, and maybe try to figure out how to get this started. Getting it started is kind of more complicated than you think because I do have to keep track of who controls what, which I don't know precisely how I want to do, and who's got, you know, what things are what religion, and I have to keep track of the monies. That's a and figure out how I want to handle any kind of negotiations and stuff like that. Which, you know, I have general rules for it, but I can tell you, I think I haven't played this because I think the burden of the setup, probably the guy who owned it hadn't punched it, and I didn't want to ask that. And even if he did, I didn't want to figure out the level of, this is the stuff I have to keep track of to make this work. I really wanted to play it, but I really wanted to play it as a big multiplayer game. And, you know, he wanted to do it too, but he never had the time. And it was hard to get, it wasn't that hard to get 6 people together for something. I mean, we played games at PAX Britannica with as many people, so I don't know. This probably is about the same amount of effort in terms of, total playing time within that 8 hours or so. Although it looks like there's a lot of turns, there aren't a lot of rules in terms of managing the units and everything. All right, let's send this up.